Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood. You just became the most expensive racist in corporate history. The words weren't spoken aloud. They echoed silently through Dr. Zara Mitchell's mind as she closed her laptop in the cramped economy seat 38E. The document that would obliterate a $6.2 billion merger disappearing from her screen like a digital death warrant. 4 hours earlier, she had been sipping Dom Perignon in first class, reviewing the final signatures that would cement the biggest deal of her career. Now squeezed between a snoring college kid reeking of energy drinks and a middle-aged man stress-eating airport pretzels, she had just detonated the very merger she was hired to finalize. The cosmic irony was so perfect, it felt scripted by a malicious deity with a sense of humor. The arrogant executive who had orchestrated her public humiliation was Richard Blackwood, Executive Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions at TitanCorp, the same company that was 3 signatures away from acquiring her client, Vitaltech AI. Had been. Past tense. Because the email Zara had just fired into cyberspace wasn't a completion notice. It was a termination letter that would trigger the most expensive discrimination incident in corporate history and turn Richard Blackwood into the internet's favorite cautionary tale. But let's rewind to where this corporate apocalypse began. In the rarefied air of Trans-Global Flight 447's first-class cabin, where assumptions about who belonged where were about to cost more money than most countries' annual GDP. Dr. Zara Mitchell had earned every thread of Italian leather in her first-class seat through sheer brilliance and relentless determination. At 36, she was the youngest senior partner in the 120-year history of Blackstone and Associates, having clawed her way up from Detroit public housing to Manhattan's legal elite through a combination of intellectual firepower and unshakable resolve. Her grandmother had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Zara's books. Her mother had worked double shifts at a medical supply company to cover application fees. Zara herself had worked 3 jobs while earning her Juris Doctor from Yale Law School, sending money home while building the academic record that would open doors previously barred to people who looked like her. Her specialty was corporate mergers and acquisitions, specifically technology deals where intellectual property was worth more than physical assets. She didn't just understand corporate law. She could dissect a company's culture, predict integration failures, and spot billion-dollar risks that other lawyers missed entirely. Her clients didn't just hire her legal expertise. They hired her ability to see around corners that blindsided her competitors. The Vitaltech AI acquisition had consumed 8 months of her life. Founded by the brilliant Marcus Chen in London, Vitaltech had developed revolutionary AI that could predict market trends with 94% accuracy, a breakthrough that would reshape predictive analytics forever. TitanCorp wanted to acquire them for $6.2 billion, a deal that would make Chen fabulously wealthy and position TitanCorp as the unquestioned leader in artificial intelligence applications. For Zara, it was her masterpiece. She had personally untangled Vitaltech's nightmare patent portfolio, ensuring every algorithm was legally bulletproof. She had navigated regulatory requirements across 3 countries, structured the deal to optimize tax implications, and crafted acquisition terms that protected Vitaltech's innovative culture while providing TitanCorp the strategic assets they needed. The managing partnership at Blackstone, the position that would make her one of the most powerful corporate lawyers in America, was waiting for her signature on this deal. Success would mean joining the pantheon of legal legends who had shaped American business. Failure was unthinkable. She settled into seat 2B with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not only earned her place, but dominated every obstacle thrown at her. Her Hermes briefcase containing the final merger documents slid perfectly under the seat ahead. The champagne tasted like victory crystallized in sparkling form. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. Everything was about to go spectacularly, catastrophically, irreversibly to hell, too. The trouble arrived in an expensive but wrinkled Armani suit, radiating the kind of aggressive entitlement that old money bought and new money envied. Richard Blackwood, 52, looked like Central Casting's idea of a corporate villain. Soft around the middle from too many expense account dinners, permanently red-faced from years of assuming everyone would say yes to whatever he demanded, and possessed of the particular arrogance that comes from never being denied anything meaningful in life. He was third-generation Ivy League royalty, second-generation Wall Street nobility, first-generation tech executive, the kind of man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued, because he had never valued the opinions of anyone who might tell him no. As he settled into seat 2D, with the graceless thump of someone accustomed to taking up space without permission, his eyes landed on Zara, with the particular expression of someone whose internal filing system had just crashed. She offered him the polite nod she'd perfected in countless boardrooms, where she was often the only woman, and frequently the only person of color, a nod that said, "I belong here, I'm not going anywhere, and I don't need your validation to exist in this space." Blackwood didn't return it. Instead, his gaze performed a slow, deliberate inventory from her carefully styled natural hair to her impeccably tailored blazer to her confident posture. What he saw clearly didn't compute with his narrow definition of first-class passengers, which apparently required a very specific demographic profile that she didn't match. A smirk twisted his lips like a predator recognizing prey. "You know," he said, his voice pitched at exactly the volume needed to be overheard by surrounding passengers, "they're really letting just about anyone up here these days, aren't they?" The words hit like a slap, wrapped in casual conversation, designed to humiliate while maintaining plausible deniability. Around them, passengers looked up from their phones and tablets, the careful ecosystem of first-class politeness stuttering to a halt as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Zara had heard variations of this symphony her entire professional life, the greatest hits album of microaggressions that followed successful black women through corporate America like a toxic soundtrack. But this felt different. This was happening at 30,000 feet in front of dozens of witnesses, orchestrated by someone who was about to pay her firm millions of dollars, while insulting the very person who had made his biggest deal possible. The irony was so thick it was almost choking. "First class is indeed a wonderful experience," she replied, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate shark-infested waters without bleeding. "I'm grateful we both get to enjoy it." She turned back to her tablet, signaling that she considered the conversation concluded. But Richard Blackwood was a man who had never learned to read signals he didn't want to receive, and he especially couldn't accept being dismissed by someone he considered beneath his notice. He flagged down a passing flight attendant with the imperious gesture of someone accustomed to instant service from people he considered staff, rather than human beings. "Excuse me, could you help me with something?" The flight attendant who answered Blackwood's summons was Monica Pierce, a woman in her mid-40s, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, and the calculating smile of someone who had spent 20 years determining which passengers deserved her attention and which could be safely dismissed. Her uniform was impeccable, her demeanor professionally pleasant, but her eyes held the particular gleam of someone who understood that airline service was really about power dynamics, disguised as hospitality. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying exactly the right amount of deference to stroke his considerable ego. "How can I assist you today?" The use of his name wasn't accidental. Monica had memorized the manifest of high-value passengers, the ones with elite status corporate accounts, and the power to make or break her performance reviews with a single complaint. Richard Blackwood's TitanCorp travel account was worth more than her annual salary, and she had learned long ago that job security meant keeping valuable passengers happy, regardless of what that required. "I'm concerned there might be some confusion with the seating arrangements," Blackwood said, his voice pitched at a volume designed to be overheard by everyone within a 10-row radius. He gestured towards Zara, with his chin a dismissive flick, that managed to reduce a human being to a problem requiring management. I believe this passenger might be in the wrong section. In seat 3C, tech journalist Sarah Kim felt her investigative instincts activating like a smoke detector. She had built her career exposing Silicon Valley's diversity problems, and she recognized the architecture of discrimination before it was fully constructed. Her fingers moved to her phone's camera with the muscle memory of someone who documented injustice for a living. Thread. Currently witnessing the most disgusting display of racism in first class, she typed. This entitled white man is having a black woman questioned about her seat because he doesn't think she belongs here. Recording everything. First class bias 1 of 47. The first retweet came within 15 seconds. Behind her, travel influencer James Rodriguez was already opening Instagram Live for his 500,000 followers. Guys, you are not going to believe what's happening on this flight right now, he whispered to his phone. This is about to get very, very bad for some people. Initial viewers, 247, and climbing rapidly. Ma'am Monica, said, turning to Zara with a tone that managed to be both polite and patronizing, transforming a respectful form of address into a subtle weapon of diminishment. Could I please verify your boarding pass? The word ma'am hung in the recycled cabin air like a small act of violence. Not the respectful address it pretended to be, but careful diminishment disguised as courtesy. The kind of linguistic microaggression that Zara had experienced countless times in bank tellers who questioned whether she could afford her transactions, hotel clerks who assumed she was using someone else's credit card, and service professionals who had weaponized politeness into a tool of exclusion. Absolutely, Zara replied, her voice maintaining professional calm, despite the slow burn beginning to ignite in her chest. She held out her phone, the digital boarding pass clearly displaying her name, seat assignment, and first-class designation in letters large enough to be read from across the aisle. Monica gave the phone a cursory glance. Not long enough for actual verification, just long enough to perform the theater of doing her job while avoiding the actual work of reading what was displayed. Her attention was already back on Blackwood, the passenger who actually mattered in her carefully calibrated hierarchy of importance. Mr. Blackwood, Monica said, with the tone of someone seeking guidance from authority, what specific concerns do you have? The question was a gift-wrapped invitation for him to elaborate on his complaint without having to explicitly state what everyone in the vicinity already understood. It was an opportunity to voice his prejudice while maintaining the thin veneer of legitimate concern that would provide legal protection if the situation escalated. Blackwood accepted the gift with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted in his entire privileged life. The concern, he said, his volume carefully calibrated to carry across the cabin while maintaining the pretense of reasonable discourse, is integrity of the service experience. I pay considerable money for this ticket. My company pays considerable money. There have issues with people from other sections wandering up here hoping nobody will check their credentials. The dog whistle was so loud it had become a foghorn. Every passenger within earshot heard the real message. She doesn't look like she belongs here, and I'm performing a public service by having her credentials questioned. Sarah Kim's fingers flew across her phone keyboard. Update. He just said people from other sections wandering up here. The racism isn't even subtle anymore. This is 2024, and we're still dealing with this garbage. The woman is clearly a professional sitting calmly minding her own business. First class bias 3 of 47. Retweets 847. Comments 123. Trending in New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. James Rodriguez whispered to his Instagram Live audience, now 12,000 viewers strong. This man is about to destroy his whole career on camera. I can feel it. Something big is about to happen here. Behind them, business executive Lisa Park was discreetly recording with her iPhone. her corporate instincts screaming that this was about to become crucial evidence in what would likely be a very expensive lawsuit. An elderly white woman in seat 4B, Margaret Thompson, leaned toward her husband with barely contained outrage. "This is absolutely disgusting, Harold." "That poor woman. I should say something." "Don't get involved, Margaret," he whispered back nervously. "It's not our business." But Margaret Thompson, 73 years old and a retired federal judge who had spent 30 years on the bench fighting exactly this kind of institutional bias, was having none of her husband's conflict avoidance. She cleared her throat and spoke with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Excuse me, young man, but that lady has every right to sit wherever she paid to sit. Your behavior is completely inappropriate and frankly disgusting." Blackwood's head whipped around his face, flushing red with the particular anger of someone whose authority had been challenged by an unexpected source. "Ma'am, I'm simply ensuring flight safety and security. You're ensuring nothing except your own public humiliation." Margaret cut him off with the sharp precision of someone who had dealt with similar nonsense in her courtroom for 3 decades. "I've seen enough discrimination to recognize it immediately, and what I'm witnessing is textbook prejudicial conduct." The cabin's carefully maintained ecosystem of first-class politeness was disintegrating in real time. Other passengers were choosing sides, pulling out phones, engaging in whispered conversations that were becoming less subtle by the minute. A young college student in seat 3A had started a TikTok live stream. "Y'all, this is absolutely insane. This racist executive is trying to get this black businesswoman kicked out of first class, and a retired judge just called him out. This is about to go viral. Viewers 3,847 and climbing exponentially." Zara's voice, when she finally spoke, had dropped to the register she used in courtrooms when she was about to eviscerate opposing counsel with surgical precision. "My boarding pass clearly shows seat 2B, first class, purchased with my own money and confirmed months in advance. I am not wandering from anywhere, Mr. She let the question hang in the air, forcing him to identify himself. "Blackwood," he replied automatically, then seemed to realize he had just provided his name to someone who was clearly planning to use it against him. Mr. Blackwood. Zara continued each syllable, delivered with the controlled authority that had made Fortune 500 CEOs sweat in depositions. "Your assumption that I don't belong in this cabin says considerably more about your character than it does about my qualifications to be here." Monica Pierce was trapped in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her training and experience. 20 years of flight service had taught her to manage drunk passengers' anxiety attacks and mechanical delays, but not viral discrimination incidents, unfolding in real time with multiple people recording and social media hashtags trending globally. She had made her choice to support the passenger with corporate status and complaint power, but the situation was evolving faster than she could adapt her strategy. "Ma'am," she said, her voice beginning to show stress, cracks. "Our system is experiencing some technical difficulties with digital boarding passes today. It appears there might be a duplicate assignment situation. Given Mr. Blackwood's Platinum Elite status with our airline company, policy requires us to honor seniority in seating conflicts." The lie was so transparent, so insultingly obvious, that several passengers gasped audibly. The fabricated system error was clearly invented to provide justification for discriminatory treatment that everyone present could see was based solely on racial assumptions. Sarah Kim's Twitter thread exploded across social media. "Holy shit. The flight attendant just manufactured a system error to justify discrimination. There is no technical problem. This is systematic racism happening in real time. I'm recording everything. First-class bias. 15 of 47. Retweets 12,847. Comments 2,156. First-class bias trending in 23 countries. That is completely unacceptable." Zara said, her voice carrying the authority that had intimidated corporate executives in negotiation rooms from Manhattan to Hong Kong. I booked this seat months in advance through the airline's own reservation system. There is no duplicate assignment. There is no technical error. There is only your willingness to fabricate problems to accommodate his prejudicial assumptions. Blackwood's voice rose with theatrical exasperation, his performance becoming more dramatic as he realized he had an audience. Oh, for God's sake. Look at this. Always making everything about race, always playing the victim card. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Always causing drama when reasonable people try to maintain standards. That was the moment everything changed. The breaking point where professional courtesy died and war was officially declared. Zara stood up slowly, deliberately, claiming her full 5 feet 10 inches of height and commanding the space with a presence that had dominated courtrooms from New York to Geneva. She looked directly at Monica, completely bypassing the fool in 2D, who had just revealed the depth of his ignorance. "Let me be very clear about something," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin atmosphere, like a precision instrument designed for exactly this purpose. "You can verify my ticket properly using your actual manifest system, or you can summon someone with the competence and authority to resolve this situation correctly. Because what you're doing right now, manufacturing system errors to justify discriminatory treatment, violates federal aviation regulations, civil rights statutes, and basic human decency." The cabin had gone completely silent, except for the steady hum of engines and the soft clicking of phones, recording every word for posterity. Lisa Park, still filming, leaned forward and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm documenting this entire interaction for legal purposes. This woman has done absolutely nothing wrong, and what I'm witnessing constitutes clear evidence of discrimination that will be shared with appropriate authorities." A middle-aged businessman across the aisle nodded grimly. "Same here. This is going straight to my attorney if it isn't resolved immediately and appropriately." Margaret Thompson, the retired federal judge, spoke with the voice of legal authority. "Young lady," she said, addressing Monica directly, "I strongly advise you to be very careful about your next actions. I'm witnessing you manufacture grounds for passenger removal based on fabricated technical problems. That conduct will require explanation in federal court." Monica's face was flushing red with a combination of anger, embarrassment, and growing panic. Her authority was being challenged publicly, her competence questioned in front of passengers and crew, and her fabricated justification was being torn apart by people with legal credentials and recording equipment. The professional mask was slipping, revealing the petty authoritarianism underneath. "Ma'am," she said, her voice hardening dangerously, "I am the senior flight attendant in this cabin. If you refuse to cooperate with legitimate crew instructions, I will be forced to contact the captain and report a non-compliant passenger situation. You are disrupting the boarding process and preventing this aircraft from departing on schedule." The nuclear option, non-compliant passenger, were radioactive words in post-9/11 aviation, words that could get you arrested, placed on no-fly lists, banned from commercial aviation, and destroyed professionally regardless of the underlying circumstances. James Rodriguez's Instagram Live audience had swollen to 47,000 viewers as word spread across social media. This flight attendant just threatened to have her arrested for sitting in her assigned seat while black. This is America in 2024, everyone. Screenshot everything. Then contact the captain immediately. Zara said, her voice deadly calm and absolutely fearless. Let's have this conversation with someone who presumably has both the training and the integrity to handle it properly. The gauntlet had been thrown down on the marble floor of injustice. Monica Pierce, cornered and increasingly frantic, reached for her internal communication device to summon Captain Patricia Walsh. The cabin held its collective breath as the call went out that would escalate this situation beyond any possibility of quiet resolution. What none of them knew, what Blackwood especially had no idea about, was that they had just created the most expensive discrimination incident in corporate history. The woman they were systematically humiliating wasn't just any passenger. She was the architect of TitanCorp's future, the person who held their biggest deal in her hands. And she was about to let it slip through her fingers with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Captain Patricia Walsh emerged from the cockpit, expecting to handle a routine passenger management situation that would require 5 minutes of firm authority and careful diplomacy. After 23 years of commercial aviation, she had developed a simple operational philosophy. Problems were like turbulence. They looked dramatic and threatening from the passenger cabin, but from the command perspective, they were usually minor course corrections that could be managed with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. Her expectation of finding a typical passenger dispute evaporated the moment she surveyed the first-class cabin. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Phones were recording from multiple angles. Passengers had formed into opposing camps with whispered conversations. And at the center of it all stood a poised, professionally dressed black woman who radiated the kind of quiet authority that Walsh recognized from her military training days. This wasn't an intoxicated business traveler or an anxiety-ridden frequent flyer having a meltdown. This was something far more dangerous. A discrimination incident unfolding in real time, with social media amplification in front of dozens of witnesses who clearly understood the legal and moral implications of what they were observing. But Walsh was exhausted. 14 hours of flying across 3 time zones, dealing with mechanical delays, crew scheduling nightmares, weather routing changes. And now this. She wanted problems to disappear quickly and quietly, not to be adjudicated with the delicacy and attention they actually deserved. She listened to Monica's carefully edited version of events, passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions, potential seating conflict, requiring immediate resolution, escalating disruption that was threatening flight operations and passenger safety. The narrative Monica constructed was familiar and convenient. A difficult passenger being unreasonably obstinate about a legitimate administrative issue. She absorbed Blackwood's puffed-up complaints about service standards, passenger integrity, and the need to maintain first-class exclusivity. His concerns sounded reasonable when filtered through the lens of someone who wanted to believe that passenger disputes were simple management problems rather than complex human rights issues. Then she turned to Zara and made the first of several catastrophic assumptions that would define the rest of her aviation career. Miss, she began, the diminutive form of address, already revealing her preconceived notions about authority, respect, and social hierarchy. Dr. Zara corrected with the precision of a laser cutting through steel. Dr. Zara Mitchell. The correction irritated Walsh more than it should have. She was trying to manage what appeared to be a straightforward passenger compliance issue, and academic credentials felt like performative obstruction designed to complicate a simple situation. Dr. Mitchell, she said, emphasizing the title with just enough edge to convey her annoyance at what she perceived as pretentious posturing. I have 300 passengers waiting to get to London, and I don't have time to arbitrate ticketing disputes or seating preferences. My crew has identified a potential conflict situation. We have alternative accommodations available in the main cabin. I need you to accept the resolution so we can proceed with departure. Alternative accommodations. Main cabin. The euphemisms for back of the bus delivered with bureaucratic efficiency and zero acknowledgement of the civil rights implications. Sarah Kim's Twitter thread had become a real-time documentation of institutional discrimination. Captain just told her to accept alternative accommodations. No investigation, no verification, no due process. Just move to economy because a racist passenger complained. This is absolutely insane. First-class bias, 23 of 47. Retweets, 47,000. Trending worldwide. CNN picking up the story. So your solution to this alleged problem? Zara replied, her voice filled with the kind of controlled incredulity that made opposing attorneys wake up in cold sweats, is to penalize me for your crew's failure to perform basic verification procedures. You won't examine my boarding pass against your actual manifest. You won't investigate the fabricated system error your staff invented. You're simply accepting the complaint of a passenger who objects to my presence based on his personal assumptions about who deserves to occupy premium seating. James Rodriguez's Instagram Live audience had swelled to 89,000 viewers as celebrities and influencers began sharing the stream. The captain is doubling down instead of doing her job. This is about to become a very expensive mistake for this airline. Margaret Thompson, the retired federal judge, stood up with the deliberate authority of someone who had spent 3 decades managing exactly this kind of institutional failure. Captain Walsh, I am retired federal judiciary. What I am witnessing constitutes multiple violations of federal civil rights statutes and aviation regulations. I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach before you expose yourself and this airline to significant legal liability. But Captain Walsh had spent decades in an industry where passenger compliance was paramount. Delays were expensive, and crew authority was rarely challenged successfully. She had developed a mental framework that prioritized operational efficiency over individual passenger concerns, especially when those concerns seemed to complicate simple administrative decisions. I'm trusting my crew's professional assessment of the situation, she said with the flat authority of someone who had made similar decisions hundreds of times without serious consequences. They're trained to identify and resolve seating conflicts. Dr. Mitchell, are you going to accept the alternative seating arrangement, or do I need to contact airport security to resolve this matter? The final ultimatum. The last exit ramp before total humiliation and potential arrest. The cabin erupted in whispered outrage and disbelief. This is absolutely unbelievable. She's going to sue them into bankruptcy. Someone needs to stop this right now. I'm never flying this airline again. This is 2024, not 1955. Lisa Park, still recording with rock-steady hands, spoke loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. Captain, you are making the single biggest mistake of your professional career right now. This woman has committed no violation, broken no rules, and done nothing to justify removal. You're creating a federal civil rights incident that will destroy this airline's reputation. The college student's TikTok live stream had reached 234,000 viewers as the story spread across social platforms. Guys, this is absolutely insane. They're literally trying to force her to move to economy because she's black in 2024, on camera, with federal judges watching. The internet is about to end these people's careers. An older businessman in seat 1A who had been silent throughout the confrontation finally stood up. Captain, I've been flying first class for 30 years, and I've never seen anything this disgraceful. This woman belongs in that seat, and your crew's conduct is an embarrassment to commercial aviation. But Zara was looking around the cabin at faces that reflected the full spectrum of human response to injustice, some showing genuine sympathy and outrage, others displaying uncomfortable embarrassment at being forced to witness discrimination, a few revealing the ugly satisfaction of seeing someone they considered an interloper being put in her place. Most showed something else, the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing systematic injustice and doing nothing meaningful to prevent it. Sarah Kim was openly recording now, her thread approaching viral supernova status. If you do nothing else today, watch this video. Watch a successful black professional be systematically humiliated and removed from her paid seat because institutional racism is alive and thriving in first-class cabins. First-class bias. 31 of 47. The video had 1.2 million views in 37 minutes. In that crystalline moment, as the weight of every stare pressed down on her like atmospheric pressure, Zara Mitchell experienced perfect moral clarity. The anger was still there, white-hot and demanding, immediate satisfaction, but it was now being controlled and channeled by something far more dangerous, her formidable intellect, operating at maximum capacity with absolute focus on strategic objectives rather than emotional release. These people saw her as a problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be relocated, a disruption to be minimized. They had no idea they were looking at the architect of their own destruction. She held up her hands in a gesture that looked like surrender, but felt like loading a precision weapon designed for maximum devastating impact. "Fine," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, except for a barely perceptible undertone that made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I'll accept your alternative accommodations. There's no need to involve security in what is clearly a failure of institutional leadership rather than passenger misconduct." The cabin released its collective breath, but something in Zara's tone made the victory feel hollow and ominous. She moved with deliberate precision, retrieving her briefcase and coat, with movements that seemed choreographed for maximum psychological impact. As she passed Blackwood's seat, she didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his existence, didn't waste energy on hatred or anger. But she spoke just loud enough for him to hear her words, delivered with the casual precision of someone stating an observable fact. "You just bought yourself a first-class ticket to unemployment, Mr. Blackwood. Enjoy the flight." The walk to economy class was the longest journey of her professional life, but she made it with dignity intact and purpose crystallized. Past business class passengers who watched with uncomfortable sympathy and whispered apologies. Past premium economy travelers who looked up from their devices with recognition and solidarity into the narrow confines of the main cabin, where economy passengers understood immediately that something significant had just occurred. Row 38, Seat E. Middle seat, between a sleeping college student who smelled of energy drinks and existential anxiety, and a middle-aged man eating airport fast food with the nervous intensity of someone using food to manage stress. The seat was 18 inches wide, with legroom that would challenge anyone over 5'6". It was the antithesis of first-class luxury, a public declaration that she had been judged and found unworthy. But as Transglobal Flight 447 pushed back from the gate, the sound of engines spooling up wasn't the sound of defeat. It was the sound of war being declared. Zara opened her laptop, paid the $49 Wi-Fi fee without blinking, and began to work with the focused intensity of someone who had just discovered that personal injustice could be transformed into systematic accountability with the right combination of legal expertise, strategic thinking, and absolutely devastating consequences for people who had mistaken prejudice for privilege. The internet connection was slower than her Manhattan office fiber, but it was sufficient for nuclear warfare conducted through legal documents and regulatory filings. Her first search was simple and devastating. Richard Blackwood, TitanCorp, Executive Vice President. The LinkedIn profile that loaded made her smile for the first time since boarding the aircraft. Not a happy smile, but the predatory expression of someone who had just realized that the universe had a sense of poetic justice so profound it bordered on the supernatural. Richard Blackwood, Executive Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, TitanCorp Industries. The same TitanCorp that was 18 hours away from acquiring her client Vitaltech AI in the deal that would make Blackwood personally wealthy beyond his already considerable means and professionally untouchable within the tech industry's power structure. The same TitanCorp, whose representatives she was flying to London to meet for the final signing ceremony, that would cement her own rise to managing partner at Blackstone and Associates. The same TitanCorp, whose biggest strategic acquisition was about to be terminated by the woman they had just systematically humiliated, based on their assumption that she was too black to belong in first class. The cosmic irony was so perfect, so absolutely flawless in its poetic justice, that for a moment, Zara almost laughed out loud. Richard Blackwood had just destroyed his own company's future because he couldn't handle sharing airplane seats with a black woman. And he had done it to the one person on that aircraft who had the power, authority, and legal justification to make his prejudice cost more money than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. Her phone was buzzing with notifications as the social media storm continued building momentum. Sarah Kim's Twitter thread had been shared by major celebrities, political figures, and news organizations. First-class bias was trending in 67 countries. James Rodriguez's Instagram story had been viewed 2.3 million times. But the real explosion was about to begin. As Flight 447 crossed into international airspace at 37,000 feet, Dr. Zara Mitchell began drafting the document that would detonate Richard Blackwood's career, destroy TitanCorp's biggest deal, and transform her from airplane victim into the most powerful voice for corporate accountability in America. The merger termination letter she was about to write wouldn't just cancel a business deal. It would accidentally create a global movement for systematic change that would reshape how companies thought about discrimination, inclusion, and the catastrophic cost of institutional bias in the modern economy. Richard Blackwood had thought he was putting an uppity passenger in her place. Instead, he had just created his own nemesis, and she was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when prejudice met precision-guided legal warfare launched from Economy Seat 38E. The Internet would never forget what happened next. The Wi-Fi signal on Transglobal Flight 447 was adequate for corporate warfare, and Dr. Zara Mitchell was about to wage the most expensive discrimination battle in business history. As she settled into her cramped economy seat, surrounded by the detritus of Richard Blackwood's casual racism, her laptop screen became a window into TitanCorp's institutional soul. And what she discovered there was even uglier than she had anticipated. TitanCorp's public image was a masterpiece of corporate propaganda designed to deflect scrutiny while maintaining systematic exclusion. Their website showcased diversity statements that could have been written by civil rights angels, inclusion initiatives that photographed beautifully for annual reports, and leadership messaging about empowering every voice that would have impressed the most cynical HR consultant. But Zara had spent 12 years learning to excavate truth from corporate presentations, and she knew where companies buried their actual values. The first cracks in TitanCorp's facade appeared on Glassdoor, where employment anonymity allowed brutal honesty about workplace reality, brilliant technology, Stone Age culture. Executive leadership is 95% white male. Ivy League grads who hire diverse people for photo opportunities, but promote their fraternity brothers for real positions. Watched 3 exceptional women of color leave after being systematically excluded from strategy meetings, while less qualified white guys got fast-tracked to VP roles. Senior software engineer TitanCorp talks inclusion, but practices sophisticated exclusion. They've perfected the art of making discrimination look like merit-based decisions. Performance reviews use coded language like cultural alignment and executive presence that somehow only apply to minorities. The glass ceiling isn't even glass. It's reinforced concrete. Former marketing director. The innovation culture is real if you're part of the insider network. If you're not, you'll spend years being told you're almost ready for advancement while watching less talented people get promoted because they went to the right schools and know the right people. Anonymous employee. The pattern was sophisticated and damning. TitanCorp wasn't practicing crude bigotry. They had developed institutional methods for maintaining homogeneous leadership while appearing committed to diversity metrics that looked good in regulatory filings. Zara cross-referenced employee reviews with SEC documents, news articles, and legal records, building a comprehensive profile of systematic discrimination disguised as corporate excellence. The litigation history was particularly revealing. Court records showed multiple discrimination settlements that had been sealed with aggressive confidentiality agreements. Martinez versus TitanCorp 2023, $1 million settlement after Latina VP documented pattern of exclusion from executive decision-making and racially hostile communications from senior leadership. Thompson versus TitanCorp 2022, $1.8 million settlement involving Black senior engineer who recorded supervisors using coded language to justify excluding minority candidates from promotion considerations. Park vs. TitanCorp 2021, $1.4 million settlement after Korean-American director proved systematic salary disparities and advancement barriers based on ethnic background. Each case had been quietly resolved with money and silence, allowing TitanCorp to continue discriminatory practices while avoiding public accountability or meaningful cultural change. But Zara's most devastating discovery was yet to come. Deep in TitanCorp's acquisition history, she found a pattern so clear it felt intentional. They systematically avoided acquiring companies with diverse executive leadership, even when those companies offered superior technology and financial metrics. The data was stark and undeniable. In the past 5 years, TitanCorp had completed 17 acquisitions valued at over $100 million. 16 of those deals involved companies led by white male executives. The single exception was a company they had acquired after its Black female CEO had already announced her resignation to pursue other opportunities. Meanwhile, they had walked away from at least 6 potential acquisitions of companies with diverse leadership teams, despite those companies offering better technology, stronger financials, and more favorable deal terms. The pattern suggested that TitanCorp's discrimination wasn't limited to internal employment practices. They were excluding diverse talent from their entire ecosystem through acquisition bias that prioritized demographic comfort over business merit. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from David Chen, her mentor at Blackstone and Associates. The caller ID showed it was 3:47 a.m. in New York, which meant he had been monitoring the social media explosion and understood that something significant was happening. Zara, I've been watching Twitter. Are you safe? And why is a TitanCorp executive trending globally for racist behavior? She recounted the entire incident with clinical precision, framing it not as personal grievance, but as due diligence discovery that fundamentally altered their client's risk assessment. David, the executive who initiated my removal, is Richard Blackwood, Executive VP of Strategic Acquisitions at TitanCorp. He's going to be our primary integration partner post-merger. His conduct reveals systematic cultural problems that would make this acquisition catastrophic for Vitaltech's innovative capacity and employee retention. David was quiet for a moment, processing implications that extended far beyond airline discrimination. You're considering the MAC clause, the material adverse change provision, the contractual nuclear option that could terminate mergers when circumstances emerge that fundamentally altered deal viability. I'm considering our fiduciary responsibility, Zara replied. Marcus Chen hired us to protect Vitaltech's strategic interests, not just manage legal paperwork. If TitanCorp's culture would systematically destroy what makes Vitaltech valuable, then this merger isn't a business opportunity. It's institutional suicide with a $9 billion price tag. She could hear David moving around his home office, probably accessing files and notes related to their TitanCorp relationship. At 64, he had built Blackstone and Associates into Manhattan's most respected corporate law firm by combining legal excellence with unwavering ethical standards. The financial implications are enormous, he said carefully. This is our biggest fee of the year. But if you believe the cultural incompatibility poses genuine risks to our client, the evidence is overwhelming. Zara interrupted, pulling up her research files. TitanCorp has paid over $12 million in discrimination settlements in 3 years, while maintaining practices that guarantee continued incidents. They've systematically excluded diverse companies from acquisition consideration. Their internal culture would immediately begin destroying Vitaltech's ability to attract and retain the diverse talent that drives their innovation. She paused for emphasis. This isn't about revenge for airplane discrimination, David. This is about preventing our client from making the most expensive cultural mistake in tech industry history. Document everything he said finally. Build a case that's legally bulletproof and ethically unassailable. If you believe this merger should be terminated, you have my authority and the firm's complete support. The call ended, leaving Zara alone with her laptop, her evidence, and a decision that would reshape multiple corporate futures while establishing new precedents for cultural due diligence in major acquisitions. She returned to her research with renewed focus, building not just a legal case, but a comprehensive cultural assessment that would justify the most expensive discrimination response in business history. The deeper she investigated TitanCorp's practices, the more systematic the problems became. Internal communications leaked by whistleblowers revealed executive attitudes that explained the company's discriminatory behavior. Another diversity initiative this quarter. How many more ways can we celebrate different perspectives while keeping decision-making where it belongs? Senior VP leaked email. Board wants inclusion metrics for the annual report. Needs some diverse faces for photos and positive quotes about our welcoming culture. Department head, Slack message. The new hire seems qualified, but doesn't have the leadership presence we need for client-facing roles. Manager's note candidate was Black. The communications revealed sophisticated bias disguised as business judgment, systematic exclusion presented as merit-based decision-making, and leadership attitudes that would poison any corporate culture they touched. Most damaging of all, Zara discovered that TitanCorp had lost several major clients in the past year due to discrimination incidents involving their account management teams. The pattern showed that their cultural problems weren't just internal employee issues. They were affecting client relationships and business performance in measurable ways. At 4:23 a.m. London time, as Flight 447 crossed the North Atlantic, Dr. Zara Mitchell began drafting the document that would detonate Richard Blackwood's career, destroy TitanCorp's biggest acquisition, and accidentally launch the most important corporate accountability movement in decades. The merger termination letter was addressed to multiple recipients: William Harrison, CEO of TitanCorp, the TitanCorp Board of Directors, Marcus Chen and the Vitaltech leadership team, and regulatory agencies that monitored major acquisition activity. She wrote with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, presenting the airplane incident not as isolated misconduct, but as diagnostic evidence of institutional pathology that posed existential risks to the proposed merger. The discriminatory conduct exhibited by TitanCorp Executive Vice President Richard Blackwood on Transglobal Flight 447 provides conclusive evidence of systematic cultural attitudes that render TitanCorp fundamentally incompatible with Vitaltech's operational requirements and strategic objectives. She documented TitanCorp's history of discrimination settlements, employee retention problems among diverse staff, acquisition bias against companies with diverse leadership, and client relationship failures attributable to cultural toxicity. The legal framework was unassailable. The material adverse change clause covered any development that could reasonably be expected to materially impair the value or viability of the proposed transaction. Systematic discrimination that would immediately begin destroying Vitaltech's human capital clearly qualified. Her conclusion was devastating in its clinical precision. TitanCorp has demonstrated through executive conduct, employment practices, and business decisions that it operates under systematic bias, incompatible with Vital Tech's inclusive culture. Post-merger integration would result in immediate talent flight innovation decline and competitive disadvantage that would eliminate the strategic value that justified this acquisition. The cultural liability exceeds any potential synergy benefits. She attached comprehensive documentation viral videos of the discrimination incident, TitanCorp's sealed settlement history, employee demographic data acquisition pattern analysis, and expert assessment of culture integration risks. The email was copied to David Chen, Marcus Chen, her entire legal team, and selected journalists who specialized in corporate accountability reporting. As her cursor hovered over send, Zara reflected on the perfect irony of the moment. Richard Blackwood had looked at her and seen someone who didn't belong in first class. He was about to discover that she was actually the person who determined whether he belonged in corporate America. She clicked send. The email disappeared into cyberspace, carrying enough legal and financial explosives to reshape the entire landscape of corporate accountability and prove that discrimination was no longer just morally wrong, it was economically suicidal. The email detonated across corporate networks like a digital electromagnetic pulse, instantly disrupting communications, strategic plans, and executive careers with the precision of a targeted military strike. Within minutes of transmission, automated systems began cascading Zara's merger termination notice through regulatory databases, financial networks, and news organizations that monitored major corporate developments. But the real devastation was unfolding in TitanCorp's Manhattan headquarters, where CEO William Harrison was discovering that his company's biggest strategic acquisition had just been murdered by his own executives' casual racism broadcast live to millions of social media users and documented with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. Harrison's phone had been vibrating continuously for 2 hours with increasingly frantic communications from board members, institutional investors, crisis management consultants, and reporters who smelled blood in the corporate waters. The preliminary damage assessment was catastrophic. Merger terminated without warning stock price, hemorrhaging value in after-hours trading viral discrimination videos featuring their senior leadership and comprehensive legal documentation that made denial impossible. The emergency board meeting at TitanCorp's headquarters felt like a bunker deep underground, as the company's senior leadership gathered to confront the most existential crisis in their corporate history. The polished conference room, usually used for celebrating acquisition victories and strategic triumphs, now felt like a tribunal where careers were about to be sentenced to professional death. Around the mahogany table sat the architects of TitanCorp's culture, 11 white male executives and one carefully selected woman who had survived by never questioning the system that excluded others like her. They were facing evidence that their institutional bias had finally metastasized into corporate suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison began, his voice carrying the gravitational weight of impending doom. We are experiencing what our crisis management team has classified as an extinction-level corporate event. In 6 hours, we have transformed from celebrating our largest acquisition into becoming the global symbol of systematic discrimination in American business. He gestured toward wall-mounted displays, showing real-time social media analytics. First-class bias, trending worldwide, with 8.7 million mentions. TikTok videos, accumulating 2.3 billion combined views. Twitter threads, being shared by celebrities, politicians, and thought leaders across every industry. The Flight 447 incident has transcended viral content to become a cultural phenomenon that will be studied in business schools for decades. Every major news network is covering our story. Congressional leaders are using us as justification for new corporate accountability legislation. We have become the case study for everything wrong with American corporate culture. Chief Financial Officer Margaret Wong, the room's only woman, and the executive who had consistently warned about cultural liability risks, delivered the financial assessment with clinical precision. Market response has been immediate and devastating. Stock price down 42% since the story broke. 7 major institutional investors have initiated emergency position reviews. Our credit rating is under formal examination by all 3 major agencies. She displayed financial projections that resembled corporate death certificates. Current trajectory suggests 70% market capitalization loss within 30 days, placing us in violation of multiple debt covenants and potentially triggering bankruptcy protection procedures. Chief Operating Officer David Park's operational report was equally grim. Human capital exodus is accelerating beyond our worst-case scenarios. 63 resignations since this morning, including 4 department heads, 17 senior engineers, and 23 project managers. Our Glassdoor rating has collapsed to 1.3 stars, with over 4,000 new reviews documenting discrimination experiences we thought were contained. The talent hemorrhaging was exposing TitanCorp's cultural problems to public scrutiny in ways that sealed settlements and confidentiality agreements could no longer prevent. LinkedIn was flooded with former employees, sharing stories that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic exclusion. General Counsel Zara Martinez delivered what felt like a legal death sentence. Regulatory response has been unprecedented in scope and coordination. The SEC has opened formal investigation into our employment practices and business conduct. The EEOC is conducting comprehensive audit of our hiring, promotion, and retention data. The Department of Justice is reviewing whether our systematic discriminatory practices constitute federal civil rights violations. She paused to let the implications settle. Additionally, we're facing class action lawsuits from current and former employees, shareholder derivative suits alleging breach of fiduciary duty, and individual discrimination claims that our previous settlement strategy cannot contain. Each revelation felt like another nail in TitanCorp's corporate coffin. What had begun as a single discrimination incident had evolved into comprehensive institutional accountability that would require years to resolve and might not be survivable. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Harrison's assistant entered the conference room and handed him a tablet displaying a breaking news alert that made his face turn ash gray. Washington Post investigation reveals systematic discrimination at tech giant TitanCorp. Rebecca Martinez, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who had received early information from Margaret Thompson on Flight 447, had spent 18 hours conducting interviews, reviewing leaked documents, and analyzing TitanCorp's business practices. Her investigation had uncovered systematic discrimination that extended throughout the company's operations with the thoroughness of institutional rot. The article detailed specific patterns that made denial impossible. Internal communications showing conscious bias in hiring and promotion decisions. Statistical analysis proving systematic exclusion of diverse candidates from advancement opportunities. Documentation of retaliation against employees who reported discrimination. Evidence of acquisition bias against companies with diverse leadership teams. Testimony from whistleblowers describing cultural attitudes that prioritized demographic comfort over business merit. Most damaging of all, Martinez had obtained recordings of executive meetings where senior leadership explicitly discussed strategies for maintaining homogeneous leadership while appearing compliant with diversity requirements. "This is corporate suicide," whispered VP of Strategic Planning, Robert Chen. "There's no recovery from this level of documented systematic discrimination," Harrison nodded grimly, understanding that the company he had spent 23 years building was collapsing, not because of market forces or competitive pressure, but because they had failed the most basic test of institutional character, treating people with dignity, regardless of their demographics. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Zara Mitchell. The caller ID felt like receiving communication from the architect of their destruction, but Harrison knew he had to answer. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the chaos surrounding him. "Mr. Harrison." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. "I assume you've received our merger termination notice." "I have," he replied, trying to project corporate authority he no longer possessed. "I want you to know that TitanCorp takes the Flight 447 incident very seriously. We're prepared to take immediate corrective action, including Mr. Blackwood's termination and comprehensive cultural reform initiatives." Zara's response had been refined through similar conversations with executives who thought discrimination could be managed like any other business problem. "Mr. Harrison, this isn't about individual corrective action or sensitivity training programs. This is about systematic institutional bias that makes TitanCorp fundamentally incompatible with Vitaltech's operational requirements." She could hear background voices and shuffling papers, indicating that Harrison was surrounded by advisors who were probably gesturing frantically for him to offer money concessions or anything that might salvage the deal. "Dr. Mitchell, surely we can find a resolution that addresses your concerns while preserving a transaction that benefits both companies." The technological synergies. The synergies Zara interrupted with surgical precision were always theoretical and are now impossible. What isn't theoretical is TitanCorp's documented pattern of systematic discrimination that would immediately begin destroying Vitaltech's most valuable asset, the inclusive culture that attracts and retains top diverse talent. Harrison tried a different approach, one that his crisis management team had probably scripted. "We understand you've had a distressing experience, and we want to make this right. TitanCorp is prepared to offer substantial compensation for the incident and commit to comprehensive cultural transformation overseen by independent monitors." "Are you offering me personal financial compensation to overlook systematic institutional discrimination?" Zara's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Because that would constitute additional evidence of corporate misconduct that I would be obligated to report to federal regulatory agencies." The line went silent, as Harrison realized he had just created additional legal liability while attempting damage control. "What would it take," he asked desperately, "for you to reconsider the merger termination?" Zara had been anticipating this question and had crafted a response designed to be impossible for TitanCorp to accept while appearing reasonable to outside observers. Complete cultural transformation verified by independent audit. Immediate termination of Richard Blackwood and every executive who enabled the discriminatory culture documented in today's investigation. Implementation of binding diversity requirements for all leadership positions with financial penalties for non-compliance. External oversight of all employment and acquisition decisions for a minimum of 5 years. Each requirement was individually reasonable, but collectively represented a complete dismantling of TitanCorp's existing power structure. Harrison understood that accepting these terms would essentially mean admitting systematic discrimination while surrendering corporate autonomy to external monitors. Those requirements are not operationally feasible, given our timeline and stakeholder obligations, Harrison said weakly. "Then we have nothing further to discuss," Zara replied with finality that felt like a courtroom gavel. "I suggest you focus on managing the consequences of Mr. Blackwood's conduct, rather than attempting to salvage an acquisition that should never have been proposed." The call ended, leaving Harrison alone with the wreckage of his company's future and the growing certainty that TitanCorp's discrimination problems were about to become a permanent case study in corporate accountability. But Zara's strategy extended beyond destroying the merger. While Harrison scrambled to manage immediate damage, she was systematically ensuring that the Flight 447 incident would reshape corporate behavior across entire industries. Her next calls went to her network of journalists, regulatory officials, and civil rights advocates who could amplify the story beyond business news into broader social and political discourse. Rebecca Martinez answered immediately. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been hoping you'd call." My investigation into TitanCorp is just the beginning. I'm seeing patterns that suggest this is an industry-wide problem that needs comprehensive exposure. That's exactly why I'm calling, Zara replied. I'm prepared to provide exclusive access to our cultural due diligence research, but I want to ensure this story reaches beyond corporate accountability into systematic reform advocacy. The second call went to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's Corporate Compliance Division, where she filed formal complaints alleging that TitanCorp's systematic discriminatory practices would continue post-merger, creating hostile working conditions for Vitaltech's diverse workforce. The third call was to Dr. Keisha Williams, director of the National Technology Diversity Institute, who had been documenting bias in tech industry mergers and acquisitions. Zara: I've been monitoring the social media coverage. This is unprecedented, but it's also an opportunity to establish new standards for cultural due diligence that could prevent similar incidents across the industry. That's the goal, Zara confirmed. Richard Blackwood accidentally created the perfect case study for why individual accountability and systematic transparency are essential for meaningful cultural change. By the time Flight 447 began its descent toward London, Heathrow, Dr. Zara Mitchell had constructed a comprehensive campaign designed to ensure that TitanCorp's cultural problems would become a permanent transformation moment for American corporate culture. The discrimination incident that had begun with casual airplane racism was evolving into the most important corporate accountability case in decades, with implications that would reshape how businesses thought about culture inclusion and the catastrophic cost of institutional bias in competitive markets. Richard Blackwood had intended to put an annoying passenger in her proper place. Instead, he had accidentally created the institutional reformer who would ensure that no other executive could perpetuate similar conduct without facing immediate and comprehensive professional consequences. The irony was perfect. The justice was poetic, and the documentation was permanent in 4K resolution that would be studied until discrimination became not just morally unacceptable, but economically impossible. Richard Blackwood's re-entry into digital civilization at London Heathrow was like stepping into a buzzsaw made of notifications, each electronic ping, another nail in the coffin of his professional existence. He had spent the 8-hour flight in first-class bliss, completely disconnected from the digital apocalypse unfolding in his absence, reviewing presentation materials for what he assumed would be the career-defining triumph awaiting him in London. His phone's resurrection was biblical in its devastation. The lock screen displayed a horror show of accumulated communications. 127 missed calls, 284 text messages, 419 emails, and push notifications from news apps that made his blood pressure spike into stroke territory. The first voicemail was from his executive assistant, her usually professional voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Richard, you need to call me immediately. Something terrible has happened. The Vitaltech deal is... Richard, just call me. Please, right now." The second message was from CEO William Harrison, his voice carrying a fury that Blackwood had never heard directed at anyone, let alone himself. "Richard, you've destroyed us. You've destroyed everything. Call me the instant you land. Don't talk to anyone. Don't make statements. Don't even think without clearing it with legal first." But it was the cascading flood of text messages from his wife that made him understand the true scope of what was happening to his life. "Richard, why are news vans parked outside our house? Reporters are calling asking about racist airplane videos. What did you do? I'm watching you on CNN right now. You're trending on Twitter. Our neighbors are staring. The kids are crying. Their friends are sending them videos of their father being called a racist. Fix this. I'm taking them to my mother's. Don't come home until you explain how you became the most hated man on the internet." With shaking hands, Blackwood opened Twitter and discovered he had become the main character in the internet's favorite morality play. Powerful white executive, brought low by his own prejudice, captured in 4K resolution, and shared with the gleeful satisfaction of people who loved watching privilege collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. Richard Blackwood is racist was trending globally with 12.7 million mentions. The hashtag #FirstClassBigot had 8.9 million uses. TitanCorp is over was accumulating mentions so fast the numbers were blurring. The video of him orchestrating Zara's removal had been viewed 47 million times across platforms. Memes featuring his face were spreading faster than he could comprehend, each one more humiliating than the last. But the tweet that made his soul evacuate his body was from TechCrunch, time-stamped 4 hours earlier. Breaking: Richard Blackwood, TitanCorp Executive VP, identified as racist executive who had Dr. Zara Mitchell, lead attorney for $6.2 billion vital tech deal, removed from First Class. Plot twist: she just terminated the entire merger, citing his conduct as evidence of systematic corporate discrimination. Full story thread 1 of 73. The thread had 4.7 million likes, 1.2 million retweets, and comments that ranged from savage mockery to genuine outrage. This man really looked at a black woman in First Class and chose violence. Now he's unemployed and unemployable. Chef's kiss to the consequences. Imagine being so racist you accidentally destroy your own company's biggest deal. The levels of stupid are unprecedented. Dr. Zara Mitchell is an absolute legend. She didn't just get revenge. She got justice with interest and penalties. Richard Blackwood speedran, ending his own career. New world record for racist stupidity. POV. You're so discriminatory, you cost your company $6 billion and become a meme forever. His phone buzzed with the incoming call he'd been dreading. CEO. Harrison's name appeared on the screen like a death warrant. William. I can explain, he began desperately. Explain. Harrison's voice exploded through the phone so violently that passengers in the gate area could hear it clearly. Explain how you turned our company into a global symbol of corporate racism. Explain how you destroyed a $6 billion merger because you couldn't handle sharing airplane seats with a black woman. Explain how you just murdered our entire future. Blackwood felt reality tilting around him as the full implications crashed over him in waves. Around him, other passengers from Flight 447 were recognizing him from the viral videos, some pulling out phones to document his real-time meltdown for additional social media content. I didn't know who she was. He whispered the words, sounding pathetic even to his own ears. That's the entire point. Harrison's voice reached a volume that violated several FAA regulations about electronic device usage in airports. You saw a black woman in First Class, and your brain short-circuited with racism so severe you had her removed without checking who she was. And she turned out to be the one person on that airplane who could end us. The conversation continued, but Blackwood was struggling to process Harrison's words against the growing recognition that his entire life was disintegrating in real time. Career obliterated, reputation destroyed, social standing annihilated, marriage imploding, children traumatized, all because he couldn't handle sharing premium airline seating with someone whose skin color didn't match his assumptions about who deserved luxury accommodations. Stay exactly where you are, Harrison concluded with deadly finality. Security will escort you to a private location. We need to contain this catastrophe before it somehow gets even worse, though I'm not sure that's mathematically possible. The call ended, leaving Blackwood alone in one of the world's busiest airports, surrounded by strangers who were beginning to recognize him as the racist executive from the viral videos that had broken the internet. A young woman approached with her phone recording. "Excuse me, are you Richard Blackwood from TitanCorp? The executive who had Dr. Mitchell removed from first class because she's black." He couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't process that his casual prejudice had been transformed into permanent digital evidence of his character that would follow him for the rest of his life. No comment, he managed weakly, turning away toward the nearest restroom, where he might hide from the social media microscope that was documenting every moment of his public humiliation. But there was no escape from digital accountability. Even in the bathroom stall, his phone continued buzzing with notifications as his life was systematically dissected and displayed for global consumption. News outlets were publishing comprehensive profiles of his career, education, and personal background. Social media investigators had found his college yearbook photos, his country club membership, his children's private school enrollment, his political donations, and his wife's social media posts that now looked embarrassingly tone-deaf in context. His entire existence was being examined and judged by millions of people who had concluded that he represented everything wrong with privileged white male corporate culture. Meanwhile, Dr. Zara Mitchell was walking through the same terminal with dignity intact and purpose crystallized, her phone buzzing with interview requests from major television networks and congratulatory messages from civil rights leaders around the world. The contrast was intentionally dramatic and devastatingly effective. While Blackwood hid in bathroom stalls, Zara moved through public spaces with confidence and moral authority. While his life disintegrated under social media scrutiny, hers was being elevated as an example of principled leadership, transforming personal injustice into systematic accountability. Airport digital displays were showing breaking news coverage of the merger termination and its discriminatory catalyst. Blackwood's face appeared on screens throughout the terminal, usually accompanied by headlines like, "The executive who destroyed his own deal," and "How racism cost TitanCorp billions." When Harrison's security team finally located him, Blackwood looked like a broken man who had aged a decade in 6 hours. His expensive suit was wrinkled from nervous perspiration, his confident executive demeanor replaced by the haunted expression of someone whose assumptions about the world had been violently corrected by reality. They escorted him through service corridors to a private conference room, where Harrison waited with lawyers, crisis management consultants, and the grim efficiency of people managing corporate suicide. Richard Harrison said, with the controlled calm that was more terrifying than his earlier rage, "You're terminated, effective immediately. All corporate access has been revoked. Your severance package depends on signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and non-disparagement clauses." Blackwood opened his mouth to protest, but Harrison continued, without pause. "Legal advises that you'll face personal lawsuits for discrimination, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business relations. The company cannot provide legal defense for personal conduct that violated our explicit policies and stated values." The professional execution was swift and comprehensive. 23 years of corporate advancement obliterated in a single conversation that lasted fewer than 10 minutes. But the personal costs were even more devastating. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife that felt like divorce papers delivered electronically. "Lawyers advise filing for legal separation immediately to protect the children and our assets from the lawsuits coming your way. Your belongings will be packed by tomorrow. Don't come home until you can explain to our kids why their father is famous for being racist to a black woman who was just trying to fly to work." 26 years of marriage destroyed by his inability to treat another human being with basic dignity. Within hours, his country club had suspended membership pending review of conduct inconsistent with club values. His children's private school was evaluating enrollment status in response to parent community concerns. His social circle was evaporating as friends and acquaintances desperately distanced themselves from toxic association. As security escorted him toward a private airport exit, avoiding public areas where additional social media documentation might occur. Blackwood caught a glimpse of Dr. Zara Mitchell giving an impromptu press conference near the international arrivals area. Her voice carried clearly across the terminal, with the kind of moral authority that comes from transforming victimization into empowerment. This incident demonstrates why individual accountability is essential for meaningful corporate reform. Companies can publish beautiful diversity statements, but if they promote executives who dehumanize people based on appearance, those statements are worthless corporate theater. She looked directly into the CNN International camera. Richard Blackwood didn't just discriminate against me personally. He revealed the institutional character of a company that elevated him to executive leadership. Any organization that would make someone like him a vice president has cultural problems that extend far beyond individual prejudice. The interview would be viewed 87 million times and quoted in business ethics courses until discrimination became economically impossible, rather than just morally unacceptable. But Blackwood missed the full interview. He was being hustled through service areas toward exile, his security escort ensuring he avoided further public encounters that might generate additional viral content. His career was over. His marriage was destroyed. His social standing was obliterated. His financial future was uncertain. His children would grow up explaining why their father was internet famous for racism, all because he couldn't share an airplane cabin with a successful black woman without feeling threatened by her presence. The cosmic justice was so perfect, it felt orchestrated by a universe that had finally grown tired of allowing prejudice to hide behind privilege and power. Richard Blackwood had wanted to put someone he considered inferior back in their proper place. Instead, he had discovered that his own place in society was far more fragile than he had ever imagined, and it could be destroyed by the very person he had tried to humiliate. Dr. Zara Mitchell hadn't just won. She had accidentally created a new standard for corporate accountability that would reshape American business culture for generations. The internet would never let Richard Blackwood forget what happened when casual racism met precise legal consequences delivered with the efficiency of social media justice. The collapse of TitanCorp unfolded with the mathematical precision of a controlled demolition, each revelation triggering cascading failures that buried the company deeper under the weight of its own institutional toxicity. What had begun as a single airplane incident had metastasized into comprehensive corporate destruction that would be studied in business schools as the definitive case study in how systematic discrimination could destroy shareholder value faster than any market crash. Within 72 hours of Flight 447, TitanCorp had transformed from predator to prey, from industry leader to cautionary tale, from acquisition powerhouse to bankruptcy candidate. The financial carnage was immediate and merciless. When markets opened Monday morning, after the weekend social media apocalypse, institutional investors didn't just sell their TitanCorp positions. They fled with the desperation of people escaping a burning building. The stock opened down 67% and continued falling as high-frequency trading algorithms programmed to sell on negative sentiment keywords like discrimination lawsuit and systematic bias accelerated the death spiral with mechanical efficiency. By Tuesday's closing bell, TitanCorp had lost $31.4 billion in market capitalization, nearly 5 times more than the Vital Tech merger they had just lost. The mathematical precision was almost poetic. Richard Blackwood's prejudice had cost exactly 500% more than the deal it destroyed, with additional losses accumulating daily as the full scope of their cultural problems became public knowledge. But the stock collapse was just the overture to a symphony of institutional destruction. Rebecca Martinez's Washington Post investigation had triggered an avalanche of whistleblowers emerging from TitanCorp's corporate ecosystem like survivors fleeing a collapsed mine. Current and former employees shared stories that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic exclusion, documented retaliation, and leadership attitudes that prioritized demographic comfort over business merit. The revelations came in waves, each more damaging than the last wave one. The promotion conspiracy. Internal HR databases leaked to ProPublica revealed that TitanCorp had promoted 94 white executives to senior leadership positions over 5 years, while advancing only 7 executives of color, despite diverse candidates comprising 43% of their middle management pipeline and scoring higher on performance evaluations. Wave 2. The review. Rigging system. Slack messages and performance evaluation documents showed supervisors coordinating to use coded language that excluded minority employees from advancement executive presence concerns, cultural alignment issues, and communication style questions that mysteriously only affected non-white candidates with identical qualifications. Wave 3. The acquisition. Apartheid strategy. Financial analysis proved TitanCorp had systematically avoided acquiring companies with diverse leadership, even when those companies offered superior technology and better financial terms. The pattern was so pronounced, it suggested official policy rather than unconscious bias. Wave 4. The settlement suppression machine. Legal documents revealed TitanCorp had spent $73 million over 8 years settling discrimination lawsuits while using aggressive NDA tactics and legal intimidation to prevent public awareness of their systematic problems. Each revelation triggered additional investigations, regulatory inquiries, and employee lawsuits that multiplied like a viral infection. The company's legal department, once focused on protecting intellectual property and managing routine acquisitions, was overwhelmed, trying to contain discrimination claims that multiplied exponentially as the culture of silence collapsed. The human cost was equally devastating. TitanCorp's ability to attract and retain talent, the fundamental requirement for any technology company's survival, evaporated overnight as their Glassdoor rating collapsed to an unprecedented 0.9 stars. Watching TitanCorp implode in real time is like watching karma get an MBA. Every day brings new horror stories about executive racism that we all knew but couldn't prove. Dr. Mitchell did what none of us had the courage to do. Former senior developer, the Flight 447 incident was shocking to outsiders, but completely predictable to employees. We lived with this toxic culture daily. Now the world sees what we endured. Anonymous current employee. 3 years at TitanCorp taught me that leadership potential was code for looks like the executives already in charge. Thank God someone finally exposed the system. Former project manager. The talent exodus became a stampede as employees realized their career prospects had always been limited by executive prejudices that were now documented in federal investigations and viral videos. Major corporate partners began severing relationships with surgical precision. Microsoft suspended TitanCorp's preferred partner status, pending cultural compatibility review. Amazon Web Services terminated joint marketing agreements, citing reputational risk concerns. Google removed them from co-development projects, stating simply, "Cultural alignment is essential for collaborative innovation." The entire tech ecosystem was quarantining itself from TitanCorp's toxicity, treating discrimination like a contagious disease that threatened their own diversity initiatives and employee relationships. But the most dangerous development was unfolding in Washington, D.C., where congressional leaders seized on TitanCorp as the perfect illustration of why comprehensive corporate accountability legislation was urgently needed. Senator Elizabeth Warren announced hearings on systematic discrimination in American corporate culture, with TitanCorp serving as the primary case study. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Corporate Cultural Accountability Act, requiring publicly traded companies to disclose diversity metrics, discrimination settlements, and cultural assessment data in SEC filings. TitanCorp had accidentally become the poster child for everything requiring reform in American business culture, their destruction serving as justification for regulatory changes that would reshape corporate behavior across entire industries. CEO William Harrison, meanwhile, was discovering that traditional crisis management strategies were utterly inadequate for cultural catastrophes amplified by social media democracy. The standard corporate playbook: apologize quickly, fire guilty parties, promise comprehensive reform, wait for news cycles to move on, was useless when the internet never forgot, and every statement was analyzed by millions of amateur investigators with perfect digital memories. His carefully crafted response had been dissected and destroyed within minutes of release. TitanCorp is deeply committed to fostering an inclusive workplace where all employees can thrive. The recent incident involving Mr. Blackwood does not reflect our company values, and we are implementing comprehensive reforms to address any cultural concerns that may exist. The Internet's response was immediate and merciless. Does not reflect our company values. Sir, this is your company values. You promoted the racist. You covered up discrimination. You paid millions to silence victims. This is exactly your values. Corporate accountability. 2. 3 million followers. Comprehensive reforms equals we got caught, and now we're panic hiring diversity consultants to pretend we care about anything except protecting executives. Tech industry truth: 847K followers. The only thing TitanCorp is committed to is maintaining a culture where Richard Blackwoods feel comfortable discriminating against Dr. Zara Mitchell's. Justice. Now 1.8 million followers. The response generated 47 million interactions, spawned countless meme variations, and became a masterclass in how not to handle corporate accountability crises in the social media age. Within 2 weeks, TitanCorp faced consequences that would have been unimaginable before the digital democratization of corporate accountability. 7 major institutional investors divested all holdings. Credit rating downgraded to junk status by all 3 agencies. Federal investigations launched by SEC, EEOC, and DOJ. Class action lawsuits filed in multiple jurisdictions. Congressional subpoenas issued for executive testimony. Client contracts terminated, citing reputational clauses. Acquisition discussions abandoned due to cultural liabilities. Employee retention crisis threatening operational capacity. But the personal destruction of TitanCorp's enablers was even more comprehensive. Captain Patricia Walsh received termination notification from Transglobal Airlines 72 hours after landing. The airline's investigation had revealed a pattern of similar incidents that previous supervisors had minimized or ignored, prioritizing operational efficiency over civil rights compliance. Her 30-year aviation career ended with a termination letter that was clinical in its brutality. Your failure to conduct proper investigation before passenger removal, combined with documented pattern of discriminatory decision-making, has exposed the airline to significant federal liability and reputational damage. The FAA launched investigation into her pilot certification, effectively blacklisting her from commercial aviation. The viral videos ensured she would never escape association with institutional racism, regardless of any future career attempts. Flight attendant Monica Pierce faced even swifter professional annihilation. Transglobal's investigation revealed multiple previous incidents of differential treatment toward passengers of color that had been inadequately addressed by management, more concerned with customer satisfaction metrics than civil rights compliance. Her termination was immediate and comprehensive. Your conduct toward Dr. Mitchell violated federal civil rights law, company policy, and basic human decency. Your pattern of discriminatory behavior has created legal and financial liability that makes continued employment impossible. The airline industry responded with unprecedented speed and coordination. Within days, Major carriers implemented emergency reforms. The Flight 447 protocol became industry standard overnight. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing personnel. Independent oversight committees for discrimination complaints. Real-time reporting requirements for passenger removal incidents. Zero-tolerance policies for crew discrimination, with immediate termination consequences. Cultural competency requirements for advancement to senior positions. The speed of institutional change demonstrated how quickly systematic accountability could reshape entire industries when the economic costs of discrimination became higher than the costs of inclusion. TitanCorp's board of directors faced shareholder derivative lawsuits, alleging breach of fiduciary duty for failing to maintain adequate oversight of executive conduct and corporate culture. The lawsuits claimed directors had ignored warning signs and enabled systematic practices that posed material risks to company value. Multiple board members resigned rather than face personal liability. Their departure statements carefully crafted to distance themselves from cultural problems they had overlooked or actively enabled for years. The remaining directors focused entirely on damage control and financial survival, abandoning all strategic initiatives in favor of managing the endless cascade of legal, regulatory, and operational crises that multiplied daily. But perhaps most devastating was the personal reckoning facing everyone who had participated in or benefited from TitanCorp's discriminatory culture. Richard Blackwood's complete social and professional destruction had become a viral morality play that the internet referenced constantly. His name had become synonymous with expensive racism, his face permanently associated with corporate prejudice, his story used in diversity training across industries. He had gone from corporate executive to permanent cautionary tale, his discrimination now studied in business ethics courses and referenced in civil rights advocacy as the perfect example of how individual bias could destroy institutional value. His wife's divorce filing cited irreparable damage to family reputation and financial security caused by defendants' discriminatory conduct. His children faced ongoing harassment at school, their father's racism following them through social media and peer relationships. His country club membership was permanently revoked. His children's private school enrollment was terminated. His social circle had evaporated completely, leaving him isolated with the consequences of prejudice he had never expected to face. The man who had casually assumed he could determine who belonged in first class had discovered that his own place in society was contingent on treating others with basic human dignity. And he had failed that fundamental test while the entire world was watching. Meanwhile, Dr. Zara Mitchell was being celebrated as the architect of the most important corporate accountability moment in decades. Her transformation from airplane victim to institutional reformer, inspiring a new generation of professionals to refuse accepting discrimination as the price of career advancement. The Mitchell Institute for Corporate Equity was already working with hundreds of companies to implement cultural compatibility assessments that would prevent future incidents of acquisition-related discrimination, while ensuring that inclusion became a competitive advantage rather than regulatory compliance burden. Richard Blackwood's casual racism had accidentally created exactly the systematic reformer who would ensure no other executive could perpetuate similar conduct without facing comprehensive professional and personal consequences. The irony was perfect, the justice was poetic, and the lesson was permanent. In a world of social media accountability and digital democracy, discrimination was no longer just morally wrong. It had become economically suicidal and professionally fatal. 6 months after Flight 447 transformed commercial discrimination into viral justice, the Hart Senate office building buzzed with the electric energy that accompanied genuinely historic moments. The hearing room was packed beyond fire safety capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent chambers, and millions more following the live stream that would shatter congressional viewing records and redefine corporate accountability discourse. Dr. Zara Mitchell sat at the witness table with the composed authority of someone who had transformed personal humiliation into systematic institutional change. Her navy Armani suit projected exactly the right combination of professional competence and moral leadership, while her calm demeanor suggested someone comfortable wielding power responsibly rather than defensively. To her right sat Marcus Chen, whose Vitaltech AI had become the global standard for values-driven business practices and culture-first acquisition strategy. Behind them, in the gallery's front row, retired federal judge Margaret Thompson sat with quiet satisfaction, her airplane intervention having helped document the discrimination that catalyzed everything that followed. The hearing room itself embodied American democratic power. Marble columns supporting the weight of constitutional history. Formal portraits of legislative leaders who had shaped national policy and the institutional gravity of representative government addressing systematic injustice. But the real authority in the room belonged to the woman who had weaponized legal expertise against institutional bias and won so decisively that her victory was reshaping corporate behavior across entire industries. Today, Senator Elizabeth Warren announced as she called the hearing to order, "We examine how individual acts of discrimination reveal institutional failures that destroy shareholder value, undermine economic competitiveness, and violate the fundamental principle that talent and character should determine professional opportunities rather than demographic characteristics." The packed gallery included civil rights advocates documenting strategies for systematic change, corporate executives frantically taking notes for their own cultural transformation initiatives, business journalists covering what was already being called the most important accountability hearing since Watergate, and law students studying what professors called the Mitchell Doctrine, the principle that individual accountability for discriminatory conduct was essential for meaningful institutional reform. Dr. Mitchell's Senator Warren began your experience on Flight 447, led to the termination of a $6 billion merger, and triggered comprehensive investigations of systematic discrimination in corporate America. Can you explain how a single incident revealed institutional problems that justified such dramatic consequences? Zara had been preparing for this question through months of interviews, presentations, and academic discussions. Her answer would be quoted in business schools, legal journals, and corporate training programs until discrimination became economically impossible rather than just morally unacceptable. Senator Warren, discrimination is never about individual incidents. It's about systematic patterns that individual incidents reveal with perfect clarity. Richard Blackwood's conduct on Flight 447 wasn't aberrant behavior by a rogue executive acting outside company culture. It was diagnostic evidence of institutional attitudes that permeated TitanCorp's leadership decisions, influenced their hiring and promotion practices, and shaped their acquisition strategies in ways that systematically excluded diverse talent from their entire ecosystem. She gestured toward charts displaying TitanCorp's employment demographics and acquisition patterns. Our investigation revealed that TitanCorp had systematically prevented diverse employees from advancement opportunities, avoided acquiring companies with diverse leadership teams despite superior financial metrics, and paid over $70 million to silence discrimination complaints, while maintaining practices that guaranteed similar incidents would continue occurring. The hearing room was absolutely silent, except for the soft clicking of cameras and keyboards, as her words were transmitted globally. A merger between Vitaltech and TitanCorp wouldn't have been a business combination. It would have been cultural contamination that would have destroyed Vitaltech's most valuable competitive asset, its inclusive environment that attracts and retains top talent from diverse backgrounds worldwide. Senator Marco Rubio, the ranking Republican member, leaned forward with the skeptical expression of someone representing constituents who viewed corporate accountability initiatives as government overreach. Dr. Mitchell. Critics argue that terminating a $6 billion deal because of one executive's inappropriate airplane behavior was extreme overreaction that destroyed shareholder value and eliminated jobs unnecessarily. Zara's response demonstrated why she had become the most influential voice in corporate accountability discourse, Senator Rubio. That criticism fundamentally misunderstands both the scope of systematic discrimination and the economic realities of modern business competition. TitanCorp's institutional bias wasn't just morally wrong, it was catastrophically expensive and competitively suicidal. She displayed research showing correlation between inclusive corporate cultures and superior business performance across multiple industries. Companies with diverse executive leadership teams outperform homogeneous competitors by an average of 35% in profitability metrics. They make significantly better strategic decisions, retain talent more effectively, and generate more innovative solutions to complex problems. The statistics carried the weight of economic law rather than social justice advocacy. TitanCorp's systematic discrimination wasn't just excluding individual people. It was systematically selecting for inferior business outcomes by prioritizing demographic comfort over merit-based decision-making. The merger termination didn't destroy shareholder value. It prevented the systematic destruction of value that would have resulted from cultural incompatibility between innovative and regressive organizational approaches. The exchange continued for 90 minutes with senators questioning Zara about the broader implications of corporate culture on business performance, the effectiveness of various accountability mechanisms, regulatory versus market-based solutions, and the role of individual responsibility in driving institutional transformation. But the most emotionally powerful moment came when Senator Amy Klobuchar asked about the personal cost of principled resistance. Dr. Mitchell, you've become a symbol of individual courage, confronting institutional bias. But you also risked your career, your firm's biggest fee, and your professional relationships. What would you say to other professionals who face similar situations but lack your resources, platform, or institutional support? Zara paused, thinking about the thousands of messages she had received from people sharing their own experiences with workplace discrimination, professional bias, and cultural exclusion. Her answer carried personal experience and systematic understanding. Senator Klobuchar, I want to acknowledge directly that I had significant privileges that made my response possible. Job security, financial resources, legal expertise, and institutional support from colleagues who valued principle over profit. Not everyone facing discrimination has those advantages, and we cannot expect individual heroism to solve systematic problems. She looked directly at the cameras, broadcasting her words to millions of viewers worldwide. But I also want to emphasize that systematic change happens when individual actions aggregate into collective pressure that makes discrimination more expensive than inclusion. You don't need to terminate billion-dollar mergers to contribute meaningfully. You can document incidents, report problems through appropriate channels, support colleagues experiencing bias, and vote with your talent by choosing employers who demonstrate authentic commitment to inclusive practices rather than performative compliance. The hearing room erupted in sustained applause, a rare breach of congressional decorum that reflected the emotional impact of her message. Most importantly, she continued after the applause subsided. You can refuse to accept discrimination as an inevitable cost of professional advancement. Every time someone chooses dignity over compliance, they make it slightly easier for the next person to make the same choice. Cultural transformation happens through accumulated individual courage, not waiting for institutional permission. When the hearing concluded after 4 hours of testimony, Zara walked out of the Hart Building into a media environment that stretched across 3 city blocks. Reporters from every major news network sought her reaction to legislation that senators had announced during the hearing. The Corporate Cultural Accountability Act, would require publicly traded companies to disclose diversity metrics, cultural assessment processes, discrimination-related legal settlements, and inclusive leadership training data as part of regular SEC filings. The legislation would transform bias from hidden liability into transparent business risk that shareholders could evaluate when making investment decisions. More significantly, the act would establish federal tax incentives for companies demonstrating measurable progress on inclusion metrics, while imposing additional regulatory scrutiny and compliance costs on organizations with documented patterns of discriminatory practices. Dr. Mitchell shouted at a CNN correspondent, "How do you respond to business leaders who claim this legislation represents government overreach into corporate culture and management practices?" Her response became the soundbite that dominated evening news coverage and social media discussion. Corporate culture isn't separate from business performance. It is the foundation of business performance. Companies that systematically exclude talented people based on demographics, rather than merit, are choosing to be less competitive, less innovative, and less profitable than their inclusive competitors. This legislation simply makes those choices transparent to shareholders and stakeholders who deserve to know how their investments and relationships are being managed. As the media crowd gradually dispersed, Zara noticed a familiar figure standing at the periphery of the group. Richard Blackwood looked significantly older, more fragile, completely stripped of the aggressive entitlement that had characterized their airplane encounter 6 months earlier. He approached carefully, obviously uncertain about his reception, and clearly nervous about potential social media documentation. "Dr. Mitchell, I know I have no right to your time or attention, and I understand if you prefer not to speak with me. But I wanted to say something important." She studied his face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation, self-serving performance, or attempts to rehabilitate his public image. Instead, she saw what appeared to be genuine remorse, hard-earned wisdom, and authentic commitment to personal transformation that extended beyond damage control. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied with professional neutrality. "What did you want to say?" "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice barely audible above the street noise and remaining media activity. "Not for destroying my career. I accomplished that entirely through my own prejudice and ignorance, but for forcing me to confront what I had become and who I had always been underneath the corporate titles and social status." He paused, gathering his thoughts with obvious difficulty. "I've spent the last 6 months working with the Anti-Defamation League and the National Urban League, speaking to executive groups about unconscious bias and systematic discrimination. It's not nearly enough to undo the damage I caused to my company, or to countless people who experienced similar treatment. But it's what I can contribute now with the life I have left." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it represented something profound about the possibility of authentic transformation when people face comprehensive consequences for discriminatory conduct and choose growth over defensiveness. As they parted ways, Zara reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them from airplane seats to Senate hearing rooms, from personal humiliation to systematic accountability, from individual conflict to institutional transformation. The Mitchell Doctrine had become more than corporate policy. It embodied the fundamental principle that everyone has the power to choose between perpetuating systematic injustice and working to eliminate it, but that choice carries real consequences in both directions. And increasingly, in a world of digital accountability and social media democracy, the economic and social costs of choosing discrimination were becoming prohibitively expensive for individuals, companies, and entire industries to sustain. The headquarters of the Mitchell Institute for Corporate Equity occupied 2 full floors of a Manhattan tower designed to embody the inclusive principles Zara had fought to establish throughout American business culture. Glass walls promoted transparency and collaboration. Flexible workspaces encouraged cross-functional innovation and artwork, from diverse international artists reflected the global scope of their systematic transformation mission. 18 months after Flight 447 had accidentally launched the most important corporate accountability movement in decades, Zara stood in her corner office, reviewing quarterly impact reports that documented changes exceeding even her most optimistic projections when she first terminated the TitanCorp merger from Economy Seat 38E. The statistics told a story of comprehensive systematic transformation. 247 corporations had implemented Mitchell Institute cultural compatibility assessments in merger due diligence processes. Over 27,000 executives had completed bias recognition and inclusive leadership training programs. Companies adopting Institute frameworks showed average improvements of 31% in employee satisfaction, 28% in innovation metrics, and 23% in stock performance compared to industry benchmarks. Federal contractors, representing $4.7 trillion in annual spending, had adopted Institute guidelines as standard compliance requirements. International corporations in 23 countries were implementing adapted versions of the Mitchell Doctrine, but the raw numbers only captured part of the transformation. The real change was happening in conference rooms, hiring decisions and promotion discussions across corporate America, where the phrase, "Is this a Flight 447 moment?" had become standard evaluation criteria for checking whether decisions reflected merit-based judgment or unconscious bias. Dr. Keisha Williams, the Institute's Director of Research and former head of the National Technology Diversity Institute, knocked on Zara's office door, carrying tablets displaying real-time analytics from their corporate partnership network and international expansion initiatives. The global proliferation data is remarkable, Keisha reported, settling into the collaborative seating area that had replaced traditional hierarchical office furniture. We're documenting behavioral changes that extend far beyond companies we work with directly. The Mitchell effect is spreading through professional networks, industry associations, supply chain relationships, and international business partnerships. She displayed comprehensive analysis showing how inclusive practices were becoming contagious across interconnected economic ecosystems. Companies completing our programs aren't just transforming their own cultures. They're requiring cultural compatibility assessments from vendors, partners, and acquisition targets. Discrimination is becoming economically isolated, while inclusion generates network effects that compound competitive advantages. The research validated Zara's hypothesis that sustainable change required systematic market pressure rather than individual heroism or regulatory compliance. When discrimination became more expensive than inclusion, business incentives aligned with moral imperatives to create self-reinforcing transformation cycles. "What's the corporate resistance landscape looking like now?" Zara asked, remembering the initial skepticism and active opposition they had faced from traditional business leaders. "Essentially disappeared," Keisha replied with satisfaction. 18 months ago, we had Fortune 500 companies publicly questioning our methodology and claiming bias training was political correctness disguised as business consulting. Now those same companies are quietly implementing our most comprehensive frameworks while announcing voluntary commitments to diversity, excellence, and inclusive innovation. The transformation reflected fundamental shifts in how corporate America understood the relationship between culture and competitive advantage. Companies that had initially resisted inclusive practices as regulatory burden were discovering that those practices generated measurable business advantages their competitors couldn't replicate. Zara's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen. Innovatech Board unanimously approved $125 million expansion of inclusion initiatives after reviewing performance metrics that directly correlate cultural investments with innovation output and market success. The business case is now mathematically unassailable. The Vital Tech-Innovatech merger had become the platinum standard for culture-first acquisition strategy, generating dozens of Harvard Business School case studies and McKinsey consulting frameworks based on the principle that cultural compatibility was as critical as financial synergies in determining long-term merger success. Elena Rodriguez, the Institute's Director of Strategic Partnerships, joined the conversation with updates on their most ambitious initiative: comprehensive integration of bias, recognition, and inclusive leadership training into business education, curricula, executive development programs, and professional certification requirements worldwide. The MBA program partnerships are exceeding every projection, Elena reported. Harvard-Wharton, Stanford-Kellogg, INSEAD, and London Business School have integrated our frameworks into required core courses. We're seeing similar adoption at regional business schools, international programs, and executive education initiatives. The educational component represented long-term cultural transformation that would compound over decades as graduates entered leadership positions, already equipped with inclusive competencies that previous generations had been forced to learn through crisis management and legal settlements. The most encouraging development, Elena continued, is organic demand from companies specifically seeking to hire graduates who completed our training programs. Inclusive leadership skills are becoming competitive advantages in executive recruitment rather than compliance requirements. Markets were actively rewarding the competencies the Institute taught, creating powerful economic incentives for educational institutions to prioritize inclusive leadership development alongside traditional business skills like finance strategy and operations management. Zara's assistant knocked to announce her next appointment, a delegation of 15 law students from Howard University who were studying the Institute's work as part of their civil rights law curriculum. These conversations with emerging legal advocates were among her most personally meaningful professional activities, connecting her to her own journey while preparing the next generation of attorneys to continue systematic transformation work. The students represented various racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds, but they shared the focused intensity of people who understood they were learning from someone who had permanently altered the landscape they would enter professionally. Dr. Mitchell began Jennifer Washington, a third-year student from Detroit, whose background paralleled Zara's own journey through public education to legal excellence. Your systematic approach to transforming corporate accountability has been historically unprecedented. But we're curious about the psychological and emotional costs of sustained advocacy work. How do you maintain resilience when dealing with institutional injustice daily? The question reflected sophisticated understanding of the emotional labor required for systematic change work. Fighting discrimination demanded not just intellectual and legal capabilities, but emotional intelligence and psychological sustainability over extended periods. Jennifer, that may be the most strategically important question anyone can ask about systematic advocacy, Zara replied. Sustainable activism requires what I call the resilience triangle: community, purpose, and boundaries working together to support long-term effectiveness. She gestured around the Institute's collaborative workspace, indicating diverse staff working on various transformation initiatives. Community means surrounding yourself with colleagues who share your values and can provide support through inevitable difficult moments. Systematic change work cannot be accomplished in isolation. You need people who understand the mission and can help maintain perspective when individual cases become overwhelming. Purpose means connecting daily tasks to larger transformation goals that justify sustained emotional investment. When you're managing your 15th discrimination case of the month, you need to remember you're building systems and precedents that will prevent future cases from occurring. And boundaries, she continued, means recognizing that systematic transformation happens over decades, not quarters. You have to pace yourself for extended campaigns rather than burning out in individual battles. Personal sustainability enables institutional impact. Michael Rodriguez, a second-year student whose family had built a successful construction business, despite facing systematic exclusion from major projects, asked about practical strategies for attorneys without extensive resources or institutional support. Dr. Mitchell, not everyone can terminate billion-dollar mergers when they encounter discrimination. What specific advice do you have for attorneys who want to fight systematic bias, but work in traditional hierarchical environments that resist change? Michael, the most important principle is that systematic change happens through accumulated individual actions rather than dramatic individual gestures, Zara responded. Document everything comprehensively. Build strategic relationships with colleagues who share transformation values. Use existing institutional systems, bar associations, professional organizations, regulatory bodies, industry groups, to raise concerns and propose specific solutions. She leaned forward, making direct eye contact with several students, but also understand that sometimes the most powerful long-term strategy is strategic career positioning. Leave organizations that resist accountability and join or create organizations that prioritize it. The legal profession needs diverse voices in positions of institutional influence, not just diverse faces in subordinate roles, accepting systematic exclusion. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering litigation strategies, legislative advocacy approaches, community organizing tactics, and the complex intersections between law business and systematic social transformation. The students asked sophisticated questions, reflecting their generation's understanding of systematic thinking and multi-sector institutional analysis. As the session concluded, Zara experienced familiar satisfaction, watching emerging minds engage with complex problems and develop creative systematic solutions. These students would graduate into a legal profession more diverse, more conscious of institutional bias, and better equipped to address discrimination than any previous generation. But they would also face evolving challenges as discriminatory practices adapted to increased scrutiny and developed more sophisticated methods of systematic exclusion that required continuous innovation in accountability strategies. After the students left, Zara returned to her office to review the final draft of her keynote address for the American Bar Association's annual conference. The speech would focus on the economics of inclusion, how systematic equity drives legal excellence and business performance. But she was refining the conclusion to balance achieved progress with ongoing challenges. Her phone rang with a call from David Chen, her longtime mentor and senior advisor to the Institute. Zara, I just reviewed the quarterly impact analysis. The section documenting return on investment for inclusive practices is groundbreaking research. You've successfully proven that fighting systematic discrimination isn't just morally imperative. It's economically essential for competitive advantage. That was always the strategic goal, Zara replied. Moral arguments weren't changing institutional behavior fast enough to prevent continued harm. But when you can demonstrate that discriminatory practices systematically reduce profitability, while inclusive practices systematically improve business outcomes, suddenly everyone starts paying attention to implementation rather than just compliance. The remaining challenge, David continued, is reaching organizations that continue actively resisting accountability and transparency. How do you engage companies that prefer maintaining systematic exclusion despite mounting evidence of its economic costs? This remained the central strategic challenge of institutional transformation. Early adopters embraced change readily and benefited competitively. But comprehensive, systematic change required engaging organizations that actively resisted inclusive practices and preferred traditional hierarchical approaches. The Corporate Accountability Index launches globally next quarter, Zara explained. Comprehensive public rankings that make systematic discrimination impossible to hide and create transparent comparisons with more inclusive competitors. Market pressure, investor scrutiny, and stakeholder expectations will reach organizations that ignore moral appeals and resist regulatory requirements. The index represented evolution from individual accountability toward comprehensive systematic transparency, providing ongoing public assessment of corporate cultural practices, rather than waiting for crisis incidents to drive reactive changes. "It's strategically brilliant," David observed. "You're making systematic bias a business liability that directly affects stock prices, talent, recruitment, customer relationships, and competitive positioning in measurable ways that boards of directors cannot ignore." As their conversation ended, Zara looked out her office window at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about countless corporate headquarters where executives were discovering that inclusive leadership generated superior results, while discriminatory practices created expensive, systematic risks. The Mitchell Institute had evolved beyond organizational consulting to become a permanent institution, driving continuous cultural transformation across American business, with international expansion, creating global standards for corporate accountability that transcended national boundaries and industry sectors. But the most meaningful changes often remained invisible. The young professionals who no longer faced choices between dignity and advancement, the diverse executives whose leadership was evaluated based on competence rather than demographic assumptions, the workplace cultures where systematic bias had been replaced by merit-based opportunity systems. The foundation had been permanently established for inclusive, accountable corporate leadership that would benefit generations of professionals who deserved evaluation based on their contributions rather than their demographics or social connections. Dr. Zara Mitchell settled into Seat 2B of Trans-Global Flight 501, the identical first-class configuration where her transformation from airplane passenger to global change agent had begun exactly 2 years earlier. The leather felt familiar beneath her hands, the pre-flight champagne carried the same manufactured elegance, and the cabin atmosphere maintained its carefully curated exclusivity that characterized premium airline experiences worldwide. But every other aspect of commercial aviation had fundamentally changed. The flight attendant who welcomed her aboard was Jessica Washington, a confident young black woman whose professional demeanor radiated the assurance of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy leadership positions in any professional space she entered. Her name tag identified her as senior flight attendant, a role representing the kind of systematic career advancement that had become possible when institutional barriers were methodically dismantled through comprehensive accountability initiatives. Dr. Mitchell, Jessica said, with authentic warmth rather than performative courtesy, "It's genuinely an honor to have you aboard today." Our entire crew completed updated training on the Flight 447 protocol last month as part of our quarterly cultural competency requirements. Your story is now integrated into mandatory instruction for all commercial aviation personnel globally. Thank you for the systematic changes you've brought to our entire industry. The recognition was both gratifying and surreal. Zara had become accustomed to public acknowledgement, but being thanked by airline employees for transforming their workplace culture felt especially meaningful, given the personal journey that had initiated her advocacy work. "Thank you, Jessica," Zara replied, observing the young woman's confident posture and comprehensive professional competence. "How long have you been with TransGlobal, and how has the industry transformation affected your career development?" 26 months, Jessica answered with evident pride. "I was recruited through their expanded diversity initiative, launched after the industry-wide cultural reforms. The company is completely transformed now. Mandatory inclusive leadership training for all management positions, zero tolerance, enforcement for discriminatory conduct, and career advancement based exclusively on performance metrics rather than demographic assumptions or social connections." She paused briefly before continuing. "It's become an environment where people like me can build comprehensive careers with advancement potential. rather than just maintaining employment in subordinate positions. The systematic changes you initiated have created opportunities that weren't previously available to professionals from backgrounds like mine. The conversation continued for several more minutes before Jessica moved to greet other passengers, but her words resonated throughout the boarding process, illustrating how individual accountability had driven institutional reform that created expanded opportunities for people who might never fully understand the specific historical moment that had opened career pathways for their professional advancement. The comprehensive transformation effects of Flight 447 had expanded into systematic changes across multiple industries and international business communities. The Mitchell Institute's Corporate Accountability Index was now referenced in investor analyses, merger negotiations, congressional hearings, and international trade discussions. The Mitchell Doctrine of Individual Accountability for Discriminatory Conduct had been formally adopted by regulatory agencies, professional associations, academic institutions, and multinational corporations across 6 continents. Most importantly, the subtle but profound changes were often the most meaningful. Jessica Washington's presence in senior leadership roles, the diverse composition of corporate boardrooms, the young professionals who no longer faced impossible choices between maintaining personal dignity and advancing their careers. As Trans-Global Flight 501 pushed back from the gate, Zara opened her laptop to review presentation notes for her upcoming address at the London School of Economics. She was delivering the keynote speech for an international conference on corporate culture and global economic competitiveness, discussing how inclusive practices had become fundamental requirements for business success in interconnected global markets, rather than optional social responsibility initiatives. Her presentation would include empirical case studies from over 800 corporations implementing Mitchell Institute frameworks, demonstrating statistically significant correlations between cultural inclusivity and superior financial performance across industries, geographic regions, and economic development levels. She would address comprehensive policy recommendations being implemented by governments worldwide, emerging research documenting how inclusive business practices systematically drove innovation and competitive advantages, and growing international recognition that cultural competency was equally important as technical expertise in modern executive leadership roles. But her presentation would also acknowledge continuing challenges and evolving forms of systematic exclusion. Discrimination hadn't been eliminated. It had adapted and become more sophisticated in response to increased scrutiny and accountability mechanisms. Building truly inclusive institutions required continuous vigilance and adaptive strategies for addressing emerging forms of bias that developed as social expectations changed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Chen. Vitaltech Innovatech partnership just achieved record quarterly performance across all operational metrics. Board meeting approved unanimous expansion into 8 new international markets, based on competitive advantages generated through systematic cultural compatibility. Thank you for preventing our integration with TitanCorp's toxic culture. We would never have achieved this success through that partnership. The culture-first merger strategy had exceeded every optimistic projection, becoming the international gold standard for acquisition approaches that prioritized cultural compatibility alongside financial synergies. Both organizations had not only maintained their innovative capacities through integration, but had systematically enhanced them through cultural synergies that traditional due diligence methodologies would never have identified or valued appropriately. Marcus had evolved into one of Zara's closest collaborators in promoting inclusive business practices globally. His willingness to speak publicly about cultural compatibility's strategic importance, having influenced hundreds of other executives to prioritize diversity and inclusion in their strategic decision-making processes, rather than treating them as regulatory compliance requirements. As Flight 501 reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, Zara reflected on the improbable journey that had transformed her from humiliated airline passenger into the most influential advocate for corporate accountability in the global business community. The systematic transformation hadn't been planned, predicted, or anticipated. It had emerged organically from a moment of institutional injustice that demanded comprehensive response and a strategic decision to channel personal trauma into systematic cultural change. She thought about Richard Blackwood, whose life had been comprehensively altered by their encounter, but who had demonstrated authentic commitment to personal transformation through his sustained work with civil rights organizations. His evolution from perpetrator to educator had become a powerful example of how comprehensive accountability could generate genuine behavioral change when consequences were meaningful and rehabilitation support was available. 10 months earlier, his collaboration with the Institute on the Executive Accountability and Transformation Initiative had begun producing measurable results in helping other executives address unconscious biases before they created institutional crises or personal career destruction. The initiative operated on the principle that people who had perpetuated systematic discrimination could become powerful advocates for cultural change if they were willing to engage in authentic self-examination and commit to sustained corrective action rather than defensive denial or superficial apologies. Blackwood's participation provided credibility with traditional business leaders who might otherwise dismiss diversity initiatives as political correctness, rather than recognizing them as essential business competencies for competitive success in diverse markets and talent pools. Zara's laptop chimed with an email from Dr. Keisha Williams, Corporate Accountability Index. Global launch exceeded all projections. International media coverage has been comprehensive and overwhelmingly positive. Stock markets are already responding to company rankings in measurable ways. The systematic business case for inclusion continues strengthening across all economic sectors and geographic regions. The index had developed into something more powerful than traditional activist pressure or regulatory oversight, because it operated through market mechanisms that business leaders understood intuitively and responded to quickly. Companies with inclusive cultures received superior rankings, enhanced media coverage, increased investor interest, and improved talent recruitment capabilities. Companies with discriminatory practices faced public scrutiny, stakeholder pressure, competitive disadvantages, and systematic talent flight to more inclusive competitors. But the index's most significant impact was preventive rather than punitive. Rather than waiting for discrimination incidents to create crisis management situations, it provided continuous assessment and transparent public reporting that made cultural problems visible and addressable before they caused irreparable institutional damage or individual harm. Companies were systematically improving their inclusive practices, not because they feared punishment for violations, but because they understood that inclusive cultures generated consistently superior business results that markets rewarded with measurable financial advantages. As Flight 501 began its descent toward London Heathrow, Zara reviewed the concluding section of her keynote address, which would focus on future challenges and emerging opportunities in global corporate accountability. Distinguished colleagues, the systematic transformation we have documented over the past 2 years represents the foundation rather than the completion of fundamental changes in how international business operates in interconnected global economies. Companies that embrace comprehensive, inclusive practices will continue thriving in markets that increasingly reward cultural competency and systematic equity. Companies that resist these changes or maintain discriminatory cultures will systematically fail because they exclude the diverse talent that drives innovation, competitive advantage, and sustainable growth in modern economic systems. Her speech would conclude with a strategic call to action for international business leadership. The choice confronting every organization is no longer whether to address systematic discrimination and cultural bias. The choice is whether to address these challenges proactively through continuous improvement and comprehensive cultural development, or reactively through crisis management after preventable incidents, have caused extensive damage to people, institutions, and economic relationships that could have been avoided through systematic inclusive practices. But as she prepared to close her laptop and complete her return to London, Zara realized her most important message transcended corporate strategy or economic analysis. It focused on human dignity and the responsibility that accompanied professional success, social privilege, and institutional influence. Every person in positions of authority and influence, she would tell her international audience, has both the opportunity and the obligation to create positive, systematic change within their spheres of responsibility. Meaningful transformation doesn't require terminating billion-dollar mergers or testifying before legislative bodies. It requires treating every individual with respect and dignity, challenging discriminatory practices when they occur, supporting colleagues who face systematic barriers, and using whatever privilege and platform you possess to expand opportunities for others who have historically faced exclusion from spaces where their talents could contribute to collective success. Flight 501 touched down at Heathrow with barely perceptible impact, and Zara experienced profound completion that transcended successful air travel. She had returned to the city where her institutional transformation had begun, but she was no longer the same person who had been systematically humiliated and removed from first class 2 years earlier. She had become someone who discovered that personal injustice could catalyze systematic institutional change when combined with strategic thinking, community building, legal expertise, and sustained commitment to expanding human opportunity rather than accepting systematic exclusion as inevitable. Most significantly, she had become someone who leveraged privilege, expertise, and institutional platform to create expanded opportunities for others rather than simply advancing narrow personal interests or maintaining existing hierarchical arrangements. As she walked through Heathrow's arrivals area toward her waiting transportation, Zara's phone displayed dozens of messages from colleagues worldwide, attorneys implementing her systematic strategies to address discrimination in their own professional contexts, executives adopting inclusive leadership approaches throughout their organizations, students studying her methodologies as preparation for careers in social justice advocacy and institutional reform work. The Mitchell Institute had evolved beyond a single organization to become an international movement spreading across industries, countries, and professional disciplines. The core principles of individual accountability, systematic transparency, and culture-first business strategy were being adopted by institutions that had never directly encountered Flight 447, but understood that inclusive practices were essential for competitive success and sustainable growth in diverse, interconnected global markets. 2 years after a moment of systematic humiliation had threatened to undermine her career trajectory, Dr. Zara Mitchell had become one of the most influential voices in global business culture and corporate accountability. But her greatest personal satisfaction derived from understanding that her work was creating systematic opportunities for countless individuals who might never know her name, but would benefit throughout their careers from the institutional systems and cultural changes she had helped establish permanently. The document that had detonated a $6.2 billion merger from Economy Seat 38E had ultimately constructed something far more valuable and enduring, a comprehensive framework for corporate accountability that was making systematic discrimination economically unsustainable while making inclusive practices competitively essential across entire economic systems. Justice, she had learned through direct experience, wasn't merely morally satisfying. It was systematically transformative when applied with strategic intelligence, sustained commitment, and comprehensive focus on expanding human potential rather than maintaining artificial barriers that limited collective prosperity and individual opportunity. As her car departed Heathrow toward central London, Zara smiled while thinking about Jessica Washington and thousands of other professionals whose careers were being shaped by systematic changes they might never fully comprehend, but would always benefit from experiencing throughout their working lives. Individual courage had generated institutional reform. Personal accountability had driven systematic transformation. A moment of profound injustice had evolved into a permanent legacy of expanded opportunity that would benefit generations of professionals who deserved evaluation based on their contributions, character, and competencies, rather than their demographics, social connections, or conformity to traditional hierarchical expectations. Dr. Zara Mitchell had fulfilled her commitment to herself. No individual would ever again mistake her competence for an error, her presence for a problem, or her dignity for something that could be negotiated, compromised, or discarded for the convenience of others. And in maintaining that personal commitment, she had fundamentally transformed the systematic rules governing professional opportunity and institutional accountability for everyone who would follow her path. The woman who had been forced from first class to economy seating had rebuilt the entire system to ensure that no other person would ever be required to accept that journey of systematic humiliation. True power. The story ultimately demonstrated resided not in the ability to exclude others from spaces and opportunities, but in the capacity to expand access systematically so that everyone could contribute their talents to collective success and shared prosperity. This story illustrates how individual accountability for discriminatory conduct can drive comprehensive institutional reform when combined with strategic thinking, legal expertise, sustained advocacy, and the economic power of social media-driven market accountability. Dr. Zara Mitchell's transformation from airline discrimination victim to global advocate for corporate equity demonstrates how personal injustice can become a catalyst for systematic social change when individuals choose to channel trauma into purposeful action rather than accepting discrimination as an inevitable cost of professional advancement. The narrative explores how modern business practices must evolve to address systematic bias, not merely as moral imperative, but as economic necessity in competitive markets that increasingly reward inclusive cultures while punishing discriminatory practices through real-time social media accountability, investor scrutiny, stakeholder expectations, and comprehensive talent mobility. In our interconnected world, where individual actions generate global consequences through social, legal, and economic networks, the choice between dignity and compliance has become economically and professionally unsustainable. Companies, executives, and individuals must choose between inclusive practices that drive innovation and success, or discriminatory cultures that create systematic liability and competitive disadvantage. Richard Blackwood's casual prejudice didn't merely destroy his own career. It accidentally created the institutional reformer who would ensure that no other executive could perpetuate similar conduct without facing immediate and comprehensive professional consequences. The irony is perfect, poetic, and permanently documented in 4K resolution that will be referenced in diversity training programs until systematic discrimination becomes not just morally unacceptable, but economically impossible to sustain. Ultimate power, the story suggests, lies not in the ability to exclude others from opportunities and spaces, but in the capacity to expand systematic access so that everyone can contribute their talents to collective success and human flourishing. If this story of courage, justice, and transformation resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more incredible true stories where accountability meets its match. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right can change entire systems. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories that matter, stories that inspire change, and stories that prove one person's dignity can reshape the world. What did you think about Dr. Mitchell's response? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss when justice gets served with the precision it deserves.